Hello everyone, you're very welcome. We're just going to leave it 1 more minute until the rest of our participants join. Thank you. Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our third webinar in our autumn webinar series on building sustainable communities, national and international perspectives. My name is Aoife Corcoran and I'm the Sustainability Advisor here at the Housing Agency. I'm joined today by my colleague Tara Doyle, who's running the back end of the webinar, and by our speaker Lorraine Darcy from the School of Civil and Structural Engineering at Technological University of Dublin. Before we start, I'd just like to draw your attention to a small piece of housekeeping. First of all, we have a questions and answers button at the bottom of your screens. If you have any questions, we'd ask that you use the Q&A function. If you just want to make a comment, please do so in the chat function. Finally, just be aware that this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Housing Agency YouTube channel. The slides will also be made available on request. The agenda for today's webinar is as follows. I'll give you a very short introduction to the Housing Agency and the Autumn webinar series. Lorraine will then present her work on mobility, walkability and neighbourhood design. We'll then have a questions and answer session where we would encourage you to participate and ask any relevant questions you may have. If we can't answer your questions as part of the webinar, we'll make every effort to answer them at a later stage. I'll add my email address to the chat function in a couple of minutes to send on further queries. We aim to keep today's webinar to a maximum of 50 minutes. The Housing Agency, which is hosting this series, is a state agency based on Upper Mount Street in Dublin. The Housing Agency works with and supports local authorities, approved housing bodies, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and the private sector in the delivery of housing and housing services. Our vision is to enable everyone to live in good quality, affordable homes in sustainable communities. It's the Housing Agency's vision for achieving sustainable communities and our recognition that the provision of housing in Ireland must be aligned with national and international climate and sustainability agreements, which has inspired this series. The aim of the Autumn series is to contribute to and stimulate discussion on sustainability topics which are relevant for housing, to raise awareness of the importance of building resilient and sustainable communities in light of local, national and global shocks to the system, and to create opportunities for collaboration and future projects. This webinar series explores 4 topics which are relevant for housing: financing the future of housing, sustainable building certification, community-led town centre regeneration, and today's webinar on mobility makes sense, walkability, neighbourhood design, and the future of mobility and housing in Ireland. On that note, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Lorraine Darcy. Lorraine is a senior lecturer in the School of Transport, Engineering, Environment and Planning in TU Dublin. Her research draws on her professional experience in civil engineering, sports participation, health promotion, transport planning to explore the design features in neighbourhoods which deter people from walking, cycling or using public transport, which result in higher car dependency, social isolation and a more sedentary population, all of which impact on population health and carbon emissions. She believes that not only should design practitioners understand the impact of these design choices, but also local residents and public representatives who can make informed contributions to local interventions. Lorraine, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Aoife. Just going to share my screen now. Okay, oh, wrong side. Sorry, I should have switched to the other way. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction, and Yeah, so as she said, as Aoife said, my name is Lorraine Darcy, and I am a senior lecturer in transport engineering, environment, and planning, with a diverse background in relevant elements of this. So I'm going to start with, first of all, people are asking, like, what's mobility? What is mobility? How does it differ from transport? And the key difference is that the word mobility has started to replace the word transportation because it is a much more inclusive. It's a much more inclusive term. Transport is basically moving things from A to B, and it is that, and whether that is people or goods, and the modes and the mechanisms we use for moving what these people or things. But mobility is much more than that, and it's about our ability to move around freely and easily. And what's really important to note then, and I suppose is what's really important for the context of today's presentation, is that land use planning and development decisions are the determinants of transport planning. Transport planners have to work around what the land uses are, because they're in that contextually moving people or things between places, and and that in turn impacts on our mobility, our physical activity, and that in turn population health outcomes and also climate outcomes. And I'm going to touch on those just to highlight just how important the neighbourhood structure is for these. And what's most important is that we need to put the human back into human mobility. Okay, from over time, we have moved from, on our feet to a combination of on our feet and wheels, slowly moving through space, to now we're just sitting. And cars are becoming increasingly more autonomous, that we're doing less within those cars as we move around, if that is how we're traveling. And that in turn has impacts on our health and well-being. So there are lots of influences on our behaviors, right? So individual behaviors, there's numerous things that do influence them. And also, just it's really important to note that these are not the same thing for any two people. So we can't simply decide on what we should do by our own one person's opinion. This is really important that we take into context a lot of the other veils, as I call veils of influence. So that would be our culture, the cultural environment in which we are living, the social environment in which we are living, and the organizational structures around us. And just to note that, that here it's a top down. So public policy does influence the structure of our communities, the organizational way things work within those communities, right down to our individual behaviors, but also our individual behaviors do feed back up into public policy. And whether it's the need for greater inclusion within that public policy, or just a public policy brought in to counteract behaviors that are happening. And you see here the community is pretty high, and our community design is pretty high in that levels of influence. Now, we do have a lot of Irish policy in relation to this, and and it's important, and physical activity and health do appear within quite a few of these, as well as behaviours, but we don't necessarily have a joined up and cohesive approach to it. And maybe sometimes we don't always understand why items are placed into policy, and why this is important, and why it is really important that we do implement these. And it's important again to say that the behaviours don't happen in a vacuum, because it's people's behaviours are an interplay between the personal determinants, the environment determinants, and the behavioural determinants of those around them and themselves. And it's that environment that we're going to be talking about today. So it's important that we explore the system of behaviours before we intervene. Right. And what I mean by that, right, quite simply put, is that we have to look at what are the impacts of environmental decisions on those other behaviors, and looking at it from a holistic place. So I always like to incorporate this health warning into every PowerPoint, and it's in the spirit of the HSE and Healthy Ireland's making every contact count. So at every opportunity, we should be drawing attention to how we can how we can apply preventative health measures, however it is. And the World Health Organization's definition of health, right? Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And in Ireland, we've had an emphasis, like a lot of the Western world, we've placed an emphasis on the medicinal approach to health, which is that we've been treating disease, and we've been placing a lot of our investment around like the building of hospitals and the development of drugs to treat disease, and not so much investment into the prevention of disease. Now, we're putting a lot of investment into it at the moment in the context of the global pandemic, and asking people to stay at home, and basically the impacts that's having on our economy. But what in that sense, it's similar. So what can we do to prevent this impact on our population health? And I love this slide from Dr. William Bird in the UK, and it just draws attention to the fact that people have an inherent need to belong, right? They're social creatures, and so for positive mental and social health and well-being, they need to have a combination of an access to people, to be surrounded by people, and to have daily interactions. To have a sense of belonging and feel safe in the places that they spend their time. That's their home, their workplace, their community, and their neighbourhood. And also to have a purpose, whether it's a job, a role as a carer, a homemaker, to belong as part of a group or a social circle. And this might be just that, making a point of waving at a neighbour every day, and that linking in, knowing, oh, well, if I wave at them, they feel happier, all right? And the thing is that the social dimension of walking further contributes in individuals' well-being. Oh, okay, I just said that. But the thing is that an absence of any one of these, right, an absence of any one of these can lead to chronic stress, which then leads to an increase in inflammatory markers within people's bodies, which then leads to greater incidence of cardiovascular disease and cancers and other illnesses and ailments. And I love this, again, I love this slide. I have a collection of slides here that I've collected over the years. And this one is a study that was done in Bristol by Joshua Hart, which was actually a replication of a study that was done in San Francisco in 1980 and 1981 by Donald Appleyard. And this is where they've gone to 3 different types of streets based on the number of cars and how heavily trafficked those streets are. And they've looked at community connections. And you can see there where the traffic is light, people are there's over 5 friends per person on that street and have over 6 acquaintances on the street. Whereas if we come down to the heavily trafficked street, they have only 1 point. And you'll also notice that as the traffic increases on the street, how people don't cross the street anymore. And if we think of some of our Dublin neighbourhoods like Ballymun, Donnybrook, places that have a big road and that causes severance in those communities, you can see how the different sides of the street, that have become quite separate to each other. And I think one of the key examples in Dublin is actually Westmoreland Street, where we have two McDonald's, a McDonald's either side of the road and a Starbucks either side of the road. So these major international companies know that people aren't going to cross the street there because it's so heavily trafficked. So therefore, they will put an outlet at both sides of the road. And the World Health Organization tells us that if every citizen in the EU, every adult, walked an additional 15 minutes a day, 100,000 premature deaths could be prevented every year, right? Such is the impact of just that small increase in physical activity. And from an Irish context, it's estimated that 14% of all-cause premature mortality in Ireland is attributable to physical inactivity. And 5% of premature deaths in Ireland are attributed to air quality. Now, a global estimation says that loneliness contributes to over 25% of all-cause premature mortality. And if we look at these are causes of death in Ireland in 2017, I should say, and we know that the physical inactivity and air quality are and loneliness are contributors because of being inflammatory diseases on cardiovascular disease, which was nearly 30% of our deaths, 30% cancers, 13% lung disease, and then also 1.2% of suicides, because I say social isolation is part of this as well and impacts on mental health. So it is huge. And walking in physical activity is, it's an anti-inflammatory, it's an antidepressant, it's an opportunity for social interaction. It contributes to strength, flexibility, endurance, and bone density. And it's an anti-aging, has anti-aging properties, and up to half the decline in function thought to be caused by aging is actually caused by not being active. Can you imagine if we could just put this in a pill and how much we would make for trying to sell it? It results in a decreased risk in dementia, and it reduces work absenteeism by up to 20%. So, I should just laid out the evidence there from a health perspective. So why don't we design for walkability? Well, one of the first challenges I came across when I was studying this was that people had different interpretations of what walkability meant. And it means different things to different people, but also means different things to the same person under different circumstances. So you yourself might travel around the neighborhood freely, but when you're then pushing a buggy, a place that was previously walkable might be unwalkable now, or if if a different purpose. So it's all encompassing. So I did a survey of different professional groups, and what I found was that engineers placed a value on the footpaths, the lighting, the cycle paths, pedestrian crossings, which focused on the movement of people and vehicles. And so movement was key here. But if you look at this example, it has all of those attributes. It has like good crossings and footpaths and lighting, but it's not a pleasant place. So would you call it a walkable place? Whereas urban designers and architects were much more likely to put a place function, emphasize a place function, and the sense of place and how you feel within that. And I found that those that were involved in physical activity promotion and local representatives understood the term as having a place to go for a walk. And so we know that our professional influence and what we see as a walkable or health enhancing environment differs. And this may be contributing to some confusion around what should or shouldn't be included in the design of a walkable, sustainable environment. But the one factor that was common to every, when we did a content analysis of the focus group studies, I said there was like 6 focus groups held with a great diversity of different professions, was this concept of scale. And what this is the perception of the size of the human body in the context of the place that you're at. So they described, first one we called escapism. So there was a lot of people talking about the place to go for a walk to escape, right? And that's for the recreational walking. So large urban parks, the seafront. And this is what Abby King calls like restorative environments. So they have a stress reduction, associated with stress reduction and a high prevalence of natural features, a sense of getting away. And and if any of you have heard of the Woodlands for Health program that Get Ireland Walking in Quilcha did, they found that when they got people who were suffering from chronic stress, chronic mental health issues, when they brought them to walk in a 12-week program walking in Woodlands, there was an 80% reduction in suicidal ideation amongst that group, which so that there is a really important role for nature, and that our communities and where we position our housing has access to amenities to go nearby, to be able to go for a walk within walking distance, because not everyone has a car. The second one, the second scale that was talked about quite a bit, or when we talked about the context of the positive walkable environment, was this human scale. And human scale is a positive scale that, like, relative to the pricing. And these are generally historic areas that were built before the 1940s, which were designed when people were walking. So there was that was the purpose. It was people were central to the design. Traffic speeds are very low, slow, and volumes are low, and there's a striking balance between pedestrians and vehicles in these spaces. And there's small pockets of local shops at regular intervals as well that are easily accessible on foot. And it's also noted your eye is constantly entertained as you move through these areas as well. So if you look at this, graphic here, you'll see on this bottom side, this is what we're talking about, these more human scale environments. You can see how you don't have to go out onto the main road to access your amenities, that there's lots of different ways to go where you need to go. And then the third scale that was talked about was what we ended up kind of classifying as architecture. And this is designed as car-centric, and the concept is predominantly related to suburban areas built since the 1960s, where there was an assumption that everybody living or working in the area had access to a car. And it's very typical of our newer suburban areas, and big box shopping centres, long cul-de-sac estates. And this is what Yangel calls 60km/h architecture, which is too cold and dismissive for human activities, in contrast to that slow architecture, which we talked about in the human scale. Now, coming back to the fact that, look, there is paths in a lot of these pictures, and there is lighting in a lot of these pictures, but when you're walking through these neighbourhoods or places, you feel quite isolated and vulnerable. One person described it like you can feel like it's like bandit country. You feel like someone could ride up on a horse and grab your purse. And those cars aren't moving at the same pace as you, so they're less likely to intervene if something was happening to you, because they're moving faster. They might miss it and leaving people feel more vulnerable. And this, again, coming back to this graphic, this is what we have here in the top half of our of this diagram, and this represents a lot of what we have built in the last number of years. You know, we have been coming back a little bit more towards that traditional neighborhood and considerations for that, but we have a lot of this segregated development type. So after the scales, the important elements that were important for these walkable neighborhoods was this concept of the village, all right? And this is a village in a rural or an urban context. And it's a distinct community where all your weekly needs can be facilitated on foot. Yeah, and it's good to have a recreational walking destination nearby as well. But you have a sense of a belonging because as you're walking around, you're constantly meeting people, you're passing people, you're smiling at people that are there in the neighborhood. You can do everything you need to do on foot and within that 10-minute walk for your house. And we have to think about the fact that, you know, there's a very large proportion of our population that don't drive or can't drive. We're talking about children, we're talking about older people, we're talking about people with disabilities, but we're also talking about households who cannot afford a second car if one person has already gone to work in that car during the day. And all of these things, like excluding these people, compound social isolation and inflammatory diseases. Permeability, this is a perception of the ease of movement through a neighborhood. And that's also through the neighborhood, but also into those other neighborhoods and beyond. And then if we kind of refer back to that graphic, it was that there's lots of different ways of going from place to place. And the terms connectivity and permeability are often used like interchangeably, that, like, you know, you have this network there and it's great because we can do an analysis of that. But just because a route exists doesn't mean it is comfortable to use. Okay, so we say, well, we did put in that footpath, cycle path, but, like, you know, there's a lot of people who wouldn't use this space. And as well, when we're putting in infrastructure, and if it's only comfortable for a small group of people, then only a small group of people will use it. And often then we'll find that people will come back and say, well, you know, why did we spend all that money on that when, you know, look, people aren't using it, so we're not going to further invest in cycling infrastructure. If it's this painted line to the side of the road where it has a dip for drainage and there's potholes on it, you know, there's a large cohort of the population who are not going to feel comfortable using that. However, when we design infrastructure that's comfortable and safe for most people, we'll get fewer people are excluded from using it, and we'll get more people using it. Also, when we have to consider the fact that a lot of the things that have been put in good faith by engineers to help people cross the road can be quite a deterrent as well, and that it can be visually unappealing and can be a stressor in the neighborhood. And there's, again, in good faith, you know, you put in infrastructure such as cycling infrastructure here, but like the footpath isn't wide enough here to pass with a buggy or a wheelchair. And then, you know, we have people that park in those cycle lanes then, and increasing the vulnerability of the cyclist who then has to go out onto the road. And here I have the question of art, because and I put this in because I was at a conference, I was presenting a conference over in Amsterdam a few years ago, and there was someone in the audience who said, well, you know, we should consider cars as pieces of art. They're beautiful and they're appealing to the eye, and you know maybe we should be providing parking spaces with more space so people can stand back and admire these cars. Now, it turned out he was a car designer. But, you know, we have to think about what is it we want from our spaces? What do we want our spaces to look like? And particularly around our housing areas, what is the function? Is the function a place where we have to have that balance of place and movement, as I mentioned earlier? And that graphic is from the Deemer's Document Design Manual for Urban Roads and Streets. So the streetscape is an important health enhancing communities, because it's the interface between our homes and our offices and our schools. And when we feel comfortable and welcome and safe, that'll really impact on how we feel. This is, I took this picture in The Hague, and so all of these houses, like, it's not that these houses are excluded from owning a car. You see no cars in the street. There was actually a community parking facility nearby, and this is common right through Europe, where you'll have a multi-story car park or a shared car parking space within like a 3-4 minute walk of where you live, and you can pull your car up here if you want to unload it, but you have to then move on with your car again. So, like, you know, these designs are possible and do exist. An important part of feeling safe in our neighborhoods is the sense of being overlooked. All right, so when we shutters it down, people feel vulnerable in the space. They feel like there's nobody there looking out for them if they need them. And these spaces that are not overlooked are also the places that we're most likely to see signs of what we call antisocial behaviour, such as graffiti, broken glass, or where people congregate at nighttime. And this places that people don't want to pass by. And we see a lot of our laneways would have evidence of this. Our laneways are good for connectivity. They're really good for public transport, for us to access public transport or get to school on quieter routes, etc. But the fact that they're not overlooked really impacts on their perception, the perception of safety in using them. And this is why a lot of people want them closed, while they are actually really a positive thing to have, particularly in suburban communities, and connecting those long cul-de-sac estates. So yeah, overlooking is really important. Oh, and also just, yeah, I knew there was something else I wanted to say on this. Antisocial behavior. I struggle with the term because sometimes it is very social behavior. And when there are people congregating, we have to ask ourselves, why are they congregating there? Is it because there's a lack of opportunity for them to congregate elsewhere in a positive and environment? Just something to consider. And just to make the point around car storage, and this is another thing that's really important to consider in our residential neighbourhoods, is that we do give over a lot of space, a physical space, to the storage of private motor vehicles. And that same space, one car takes up, you can have 5 people cycling through that space, 20 people walking in that space, 12 cycle parking spaces. And considering that, now this is a stat from London, but considering that the average car in London carries only 1.56, so 1.5 people, is that an equitable use of space when our land is so precious and valuable, as especially those of you who are involved in delivering housing will know like how hard it is to find those land pockets. And also that, if we design for people, we will get people. And I'll urge any of you who are not familiar with the work that was done in Clonakilty to have a look at that. So how do we spot opportunities to increase the walkability, livability of our communities? Well, what we'll find is that the places where people are seen to not behave or not to be doing what we're trying to tell them to do. For example, where they knock down fences. If they knock it once, they're telling you a clear story. If they knock it again, they're telling you a very clear story. If it keeps being knocked, they really want a pat there. Will you please put one in? Up in the top right, this is on the Snugborough Road extension in Blanchardstown. That shopping trolley appears and disappears quite frequently, and that shopping trolley is actually put there to be used to jump the wall. So there is a desire path there. People want to go there, and if you go over to the wall, you'll notice that there's no moss on some parts of it where people have jumped over. And there's a social acceptance around this. However, there's a reluctance to open up a laneway there. And by not opening up that laneway, we're excluding people with mobility issues, older people, people pushing buggies, and they have to go the long way around if they do not have an access to a car and they're not able to walk that 3 kilometres or 4 kilometres, whatever it is, that they're excluding from participating in society. On the bottom right or bottom left, we have an example where someone is showing us that they have a desire line. They want to cross the road at that location, but that's not being facilitated for them. And also this isolated public transport stop where, there's a footpath right up to it, but then you're waiting for your bus there. You're waiting alone and in a very vulnerable place. So, yeah, I put that slide in again just to make the point that, if we look between where these housing apartments and these different segregated routes, there's lots of evidence there that people want these areas to be connected, but we have to sometimes have a look at where to find that information. And observation is one of the key ways. So we need to break from the design norm because sometimes we use the justification that there is no one walking or cycling in that space for not providing for pedestrians or cyclists. And it doesn't mean that there's no need for them. It's actually, there's a greater need. If people aren't using it in that way, there is a greater need. And conscious now of time, but I want to just go through a few outputs again from my PhD work, where I did a survey around 16 neighbourhoods in Dublin, categorised into 4 different neighbourhood types. So high walkable, not deprived. So these were some of them were more affluent traditional villages in the city, and many of these were along the coastal routes. Then we have our high walkable deprived, and these again were traditional neighbourhoods, much more in the inner city. Then we have low walkable, not deprived. These were our newer suburbs outside the M50. in general, and then low walkable deprived, where some of these were the social housing estates that were built in the outer city circa the 1960s. And we classified these for their walkability based on the criteria that came about from the previous studies, which I've mentioned. And then we surveyed these neighbourhoods. And so we surveyed, as I said, 16 neighbourhoods. We got a really positive response rate of 47%. That was based on the fact that we did a very inclusive type of data collection, and we got over 1,000 people. Now, like, yes, we only had a 37% male represent, but actually this was quite representative of other surveys in Ireland. And also the fact that we were surveying in some low socioeconomic areas where there's a greater proportion of female heads of household in these neighbourhoods. Now, also, there was like we called to many houses where if we met a male at the door, they were like, I'll give this to the boss, handing it over to the female of the household. So the key things, right, that when it came to neighbourhood perceptions, and the neighbourhoods differed on between high and low walkability. So excluding socioeconomics, they differed on their scale, their perception scale. So we had indicators to measure this on the village: permeability, public transport access, places to go for a walk, and destinations. So, and to get this, so these were the key differences between what was a high and low walkable area from neighbourhood perceptions, which verified what our site selection. Now, the key difference between the deprived and not deprived areas came down to a perception of crime and disorder in their neighbourhoods, and a vulnerability and a fear of their own personal safety. So when it came to their actual behaviours and where they went, we asked them about how did you travel to these different facilities within their community, like the shop, the school, the place to go to socialise, the supermarket, the creche or childcare facility, a place to go to exercise, public transport, bank or credit union, their friend or family member they visit most often, or a place of worship. And so we only counted those that they did actually go to. And what we found was that there was a massive difference between those that were living in, these are what we call the suburban areas outside the M50, the low walkable, not deprived. And these were relatively affluent. There was a high, they actually had a high employment rate. There were younger people, they had a lower duration of residency, which was to be expected in these neighbourhoods, but they were much more car dependent than the other neighbourhoods. Now, those that were in the low walkable deprived, so those social housing estates on the outer city, they also differed quite a bit in how they travelled compared to their high walkable deprived counterparts in the city centre. That scored higher on the on how they travelled. So, and also in relation to behaviours, okay, and I think this is important. So if you live in a low walkable, not deprived area, so these are outer suburbs, newer builds, typically typical of developed built suburbs, you're significantly more likely to have more cars per adult in your household, spend more on fuel, and do less active travel than residents in other area categories. And you're also less likely to do less minutes for recreation than your higher walkable counterparts. Right, so you're walking less. And also your carbon emissions, and this is unpublished data, was a study done by one of the final year project students using the data that I collected. You'll see that they have a much higher carbon footprint. So in the bottom right, the not deprived low walkables. The high walkable, not deprived, still scored higher in their carbon emission compared to the low walkable deprived. So they still had a relatively high car usage. Now, however, if you're poor and you're living in a low walkable neighbourhood, it means you're significantly more likely to have more cars per adult and do less active travel than if you lived in a high walkable neighbourhood. And where there isn't a significant difference in your fuel spend, the average low walkable deprived household spends €10 more per week on fuel, despite earning 12,000 less per annum before tax than in high walkable deprived households. Right, so they're less affluent in those neighbourhoods than they were in the high walkable deprived areas in the inner city, the traditional neighbourhoods. And this was leading to a fuel poverty and a transport poverty. It's costing you more. And so this does impact on access to work, because a lot of the lower paid work that they would be accessing would be in the other suburbs as well, requiring a car to get between suburbs. And so if you didn't have a car, if you could not afford a car, you couldn't access that work. It was costing you more to access that work. Therefore, can you afford to work? And it's important to note that public transport is a key active is an active travel mode. So public transport is active travel because it always includes a walking or cycling trip, and it is a key element of active communities. And I have some examples of some newer developments. So Malmo in Sweden, that's B001. And again, similar to The Hague, where I showed you, in this case, they have a shared parking facilities, underground parking facility, because this was a docklands reclamation, and which is easily accessed. There's like little stairs down every so often to the storage areas underneath the houses. And just to, just things like ensuring that we keep the permeability through the city in our new developments. I really like how this was done in Hanover Lane, where the even though that was built over, that it maintained the permeability through it, and that there needs to be invitations to play and engage in space and invitations to stay in the space. And Joe, I'm actually going to leave it there. We've run out of time, but what a lot of here was just more examples of just paths that have been put in that have increased permeability. But I think it'd be better for us to have time to chat.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Lorraine. Very interesting and very insightful, and some of the research you've done is actually is very interesting, especially how we may be putting people into transport poverty in certain areas by encouraging the use of the car. Just to start with a couple of questions. In relation to what you're seeing, I suppose, in Ireland in terms of mobility and walkability and some of the housing developments, do you think, in your own opinion, in some of the more recent housing developments that you're seeing, that we're still encouraging car dependency, or do you think it's moved away from this a little bit in Ireland? Or
what I think has been really interesting, and again, and I can't say that I've seen everything that's been built recently, but I think this what's been quite interesting is in the build to let developments that have gone in more recently. They're much more sustainable transport focused, whereas those that are built to sell, they still have this real prevalence of every house having parking spaces outside it, and there being a lot of space for cars and a need for this kind of perceived need. And I'm wondering if is that something that the developers think that they have to provide that space, or else it won't sell? Is it market forces or perceived market forces rather than what people actually want and need, and how best can we deliver it? But I just think it's been interesting in the difference there. Things have improved, and if we go back to Celtic Tiger boom time, we had these gated long cul-de-sac estates, which ironically used to be called village and close, and all of these terms that implied that you were going to have this wonderful sense of community within them, where people were actually gone the majority of the day. And it was actually really difficult for us to do data collection in those neighborhoods because people were gone first thing in the morning. There weren't that many people there during the day. We had to buy a sample until we had to get creative in how we collected the information, because we were just getting new mums at home and older people. But other people weren't returning to their houses until the evening. They were just having their dinner, going to bed, or they were going back out to go to the gym, getting back into their cars. They just didn't have that sense of community. Whereas I think there's a greater awareness in that connectivity. And a lot of that has to do with planning and the planning requirements and making sure that happens.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions in here from our participants. What is your opinion on covered footpaths and walkways? In Singapore, on alighting from an MRT, some walkways are covered. In Ireland, would covered walkways for a kilometre or two around the town assist in promoting walking?
So I'm assuming that this is just that there's some kind of an awning over it as opposed to being a tunnel. Because in some places it's almost like an underpass. Underpasses are bad for walkability. I do have a concern around the underpasses that have been proposed for the upgrading on the Dart. That's just my own personal opinion, because there's a perception of safety that we need to consider. Overpasses are also bad, because if people can't see what's at the other side, they're less likely to go over them. Sheltered areas, and so it's not necessarily that we need to put an awning over it. Sometimes it's actually trees can provide that shelter, or it's the scale of the area. So if the houses are relatively close together, that or the street is a more human scale, you're less likely to get that same impact of wind and rain than you are in a more architecture space. And it's also been really interesting. Like, I think part of the conversation around this is actually the quality of footpaths. And I think we might have had this chat. I had some chat with someone recently. It might have been you, Aoife. I was talking about the Selena Sláinseas. All right, so it was an intervention done by the Irish Heart Foundation where they put in these walking routes around towns all over Ireland, and they marked the number of kilometres. And you see lots of people walking on them in the evening time. They were well lit, good quality footpaths, but the actual environment was, like, again, coming back to that architecture, quite hostile. But people were choosing to walk on them because the footpaths were flatter and they were well lit. So there was elements of it that were positive, but they weren't like what we would consider health enhancing neighborhoods in relation to nice greenery, like the exposure to nature. There's a whole lot of the other elements that were missing from that. And in some places, some of these places were called really interesting things, like the Fat Mile, and colloquially, people were they were associating. That's where you went for a walk in the evening along these places, and just an interesting story that like, I'm from a really, really rural part of the country, and one of my near neighbours, when she retired, moved to a town to live near her sister. And she told me, we were just chatting about my research one day, and she told me that people were constantly stopping to offer her a lift when she was walking to mass. And but she couldn't understand how she was walking to mass to get her physical activity in. But she said, well, I get to watch Coronation Street because they're all out getting their walk later on. There was a disconnect between walking for your everyday needs being your physical activity and getting exercise versus the going for a walk, purposeful walk in the evening. And I think there's messaging that needs to be done around that too.
Definitely. So we've got a few more questions come in here. Do you think parents have a preference for housing estates with less through roads as they perceive these to be safer for children playing outside? And is this a false perception?
Yes, it's a false perception. I'm going to start with that. And I think a lot of, it comes down to kind of marketing and not necessarily marketing on behalf of the people selling the houses, but also just this kind of societal conversation around it. It's a perception of safety, because when we market, when we see new cars being advertised, they're always in empty streets. When we see markup drawings and imagery of new developments, there's hardly any cars on the road. But then you go out and visit them shortly afterwards, and you'll see there's 2 cars outside of each house. 1 car is parked up on top of a footpath. So sometimes it is that perception of that, and that cul-de-sac as well. So this also has a part to do on where we were brought up ourselves, our experiences growing up, and what's normal to us, and also to do with the perception that, like, again, speaking in the context of someone who came from the countryside, that the townies, like, was all rough in the town, whereas when you lived in the countryside, it was nice and safe. And that's ingrained in our psyche, that idea that if you live in the city centre. Whereas I live now, I've chose to live in a walkable neighbourhood in just on the edge of the outer city, close to the inner city. And what I find is there's way more people walking and cycling through the neighbourhood, and there's a kind of a consideration for that. And chatting to my 93-year-old neighbour the other day, she was like, well, all the kids used to just play out on the road. You kind of wonder what's different here. And it's a priority thing. Those suburban neighbourhoods that people perceive to be safer quite often have a higher car ownership and higher car requirement because of where they are. That isn't always necessarily taken into the decision making, and people, that's not always part of the conversation.
Very interesting. So a lot of our stakeholders are from outside of Dublin, and we've got a bit of interest coming in that you said that you're from a rural area in Ireland. So we have a question here. Could you talk about the rural context, the particular challenges, and any studies or initiatives would be helpful to know about? Is there a sense among designers and planners that it's just too big or too difficult to change away from car dependency? So what's your thoughts on that? Or
well, so like again, depending on how you're trained and who you were trained by, you're going to have a different perspective on what the solution is. And I was trained as a civil engineer. I was involved in the design of some of those long cul-de-sac estates, but my social conscience took over and I left that. But what's normalized in your practice and the decision makers around you will influence what people think. And if the narrative is it is too difficult to do, you will think it's too difficult to do, rather than thinking more creatively about how you do it. The same principles apply in relation to what is a walkable neighbourhood, whether it's in any context. So that village is important. And even that rural village, when you think back to how people lived, that, being able to access things on foot, and also that's what makes good rural public transport. How we can provide good rural public transport is having little nodes and nodes where people can meet. And sometimes they don't have to be villages in themselves. It can be that 5 crossroads where people used to get the school bus from. That can be your hub and your node. But if you're delivering housing, it is good to place it near those locations. So we have it more compact, more houses closer together. It is very difficult to retrofit for one-off rural housing. And but also the walkability, cyclability, the less people that are walking and cycling, the less aware people are in their driving, and that increases the vulnerability. This again, ad hoc and anecdotal. I had a conversation with friends at home one day going, if you knew that there was someone who walked the road at a particular time of the day, do you behave differently as a driver when you're driving those roads? And they all agreed that they did. If they knew that someone, there's likely to be someone cycling to school, because they always do, they drive slower. So and there is considerations to be given around those rural villages and towns in relation to services and being able to build with those services, and that's something we've underinvested in years, and something we have to consider.
Okay, we have another question here. What is your solution to changing movement patterns and improving inclusive walkable communities? So
I suppose it all depends that it's what are you coming from to, right? Opening up laneways, right? So when we think of some of our older suburbs, so I'm thinking of places like Knocknacarra and Galway. I'm thinking of places that were built around that time. So Rathfarnham in Dublin, where this has started to happen a bit. Leicester in Dublin, another example. So these laneways that people have been closing down, we need to reopen them. And I know that that's a really difficult thing to convince communities to do. But that's what increases access to public transport, being able to walk to school. The laneways, there's lots of places in Ireland that have laneways at the back of houses. That also they can become lovely quiet ways for people to access to school. So really it's looking at the map of a neighbourhood and saying, where are the barriers to movement? How could we move through the neighbourhood? And when people object to these things, we have to respect that. Is this coming from a place for a real and genuine fear? Whether that fear has been built up through things that people have been saying locally and stories that, are things that people are saying to kind of incite fear. We also need to hear from the people who do regularly use them and what they think of them and how they think they might be improved, rather than taking an opportunity to just shut them down. And I think local politicians have a major role to play in that, because sometimes, it's seen as a big win for them to do something quick and easy, like closing off a lane, and, without regard for how that impacts on population health and well-being.
Okay, excellent. We have a couple of more questions there, but just a question for myself, I suppose. Is there any things in terms of walkability and mobility that we should avoid doing in housing developments?
Number one thing I would say is dipped curbs. So, or not dipped curbs, the dipped footpaths. So, please keep, this is my little begging, my begging bowl. Please keep the footpath flat outside houses, where there's going to be cars coming in and out, flat for at least 1.8 to 2.5 meters, and then have your dip at the edge out onto the road. Because, when you're pushing a buggy, if you're on a wheelchair, if you're an old person with a mobility age, the fact that you're constantly going up and down and on a dip, that really, really impacts on someone's comfort. And and that results in falls for older people, who then will stop going out, and that will lead to more social isolation in these neighborhoods. So that's my number one bugbear in relation to how simple design can make a big difference. And so that would be the key one. And the second one really is that connecting up neighborhoods and having that freedom of movement and connectivity.
Okay.
And last one, making sure you can get out to the bus stop from wherever the bus stop is placed. And I appreciate, depending on the speed of the road, the bus stop isn't always necessarily near the junction. Just making sure you can get out to that bus stop or that train stop, accessing public transport. You don't have to do a big massive loop to get to that.
Yeah, so you don't have to install a free trolley at the edge of the estate, like you showed us there earlier on. Okay, we have a couple of more questions, if you can bear with us for another couple of minutes, if that's okay. A question in, should we require a specific mobility statement at planning application stage?
Yes. And what's really important is that they're followed up. We do write mobility management plans for developments, depending on the local authority, but the majority of them require them now. But they aren't always followed through on and checked up on. And that, I know that comes down to resourcing within local authorities, and that's understandable, but we do need to put an emphasis on checking back in on that and making sure that they're implemented. It should absolutely be part of it. And also that we should be considering not just transport determinants, right? Because we judge transport efficiency on time of distance from the car's perspective. We don't always look at it from how easy it is to cross, the number of crossings, and from a walkability perspective, and we need to integrate that more into our mobility plans.
Okay, excellent. And just two more questions here. Is there evidence that walkability changes from winter to summer? I live in a neighbourhood that has escape walks during the day. Oh, I wonder where they live, but nothing at night due to lack of public lighting.
Yeah, no, time of day, weather, they all impact on what that individual. At the very start, I said that it means different things, different people, and different things in different contexts. An example that I always love to use is Henry Street, like a very walkable place during business hours, but in the evening when the shutters comes down, it just becomes, like someone called it, a traffic desert. It's a really isolating place and space. So uses throughout the day and night is really important. So Camden Street scored really highly on our walkability when we talked about, like, the footpaths are atrocious. The traffic, there's loads of traffic there, but it's the fact that there's life there all day and all night meant that people felt safe there, even though, there was different perceptions of that, but different people think of different things. Yeah.
Okay, and then we've a question here. Is there any research for the low income deprived neighbourhoods showing the compound impact of multiple deprivations, including the lack of access?
I have the data, I just haven't analysed it yet.
Okay, well,
no, but there is international evidence of that. Yes, that is something that is, and socioeconomics is a determinant of health, and and for numerous different compounding reasons. Yes.
Okay, and one final question here. How would you influence people installing dipped curbs for wheelchair users at crossing points?
So I'm assuming that is to ensure that they have them. Well, depending on where the crossing point is, if the crossing point is in a residential area, the crossing point should be raised to the height of the footpath, because we should be we should be prioritizing, is what I should say, prioritizing the movement of the pedestrian or somebody on a bike or a mobility aid. They should be prioritized in those locations. So we raise, in those locations, we raise we put in a ramp basically up to the footpath level. On a main street where it is like busier road, where you're going to have more crossings that are signalized and permission to cross, etc., then yes, then we do need that dipping. But there's something really interesting, there's an interesting oxymoron that, like, we haven't got to the bottom of yet, and it's something that it's only been really recently brought to our attention, is the tactile paving that we've used for accessibility for people, for blind people or people with visual impairments, are actually having a really negative impact on cane users, right? So people from the same cohort, because they're getting a lot of repetitive strain injury on their wrists from rubbing over the bumps, but also it's also true of uneven footpaths, but also clutter on the footpaths when they're banging off things, that it's having, like, there's a resonance happening in there, and which is, so a lot of you probably notice it now that I've said it, you'll see a lot of cane users also wearing wrist supports now.
Okay, so very interesting, and we have a lot to consider, I think, in terms of walkability and mobility, in terms of housing and the future housing that we're going to build in this country, but also how we might retrofit some of our current neighbourhoods. So I think you've given us a huge amount to think about, and I've a lot of stuff that I didn't know as well. Look, I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon on behalf of ourselves here at Housing Agency, but also our different stakeholders listening. If anyone has any further questions, please send them on to me here at the Housing Agency.
And if you don't mind, I'm just going to put up my slide back up for 1 second.
Yeah, perfect.
Because I want to just take this opportunity that we have. So there's like in TU Dublin, we have these are just 2 of the masters that we have these are part-time masters, so they're designed for people that are working in industry. And so we have our MSc in Sustainable Transport and Mobility and our MSc in Urban Regeneration and Development. And both of these are January start programs, which is why I wanted to put them up today and directly relevant to the topic today. And just to say that all of our modules are also available at CPD. So if you're interested in those, just give us a shout.
Okay, so we'd encourage everyone that is interested in learning more or improving their knowledge in these areas to contact Lorraine. And also for anyone that's interested, next week we have our final webinar on the German Sustainable Building Certificates next week, next Thursday. So thanks again, Lorraine, and thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye now.